Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Dismissed by the Governor and repudiating debt repayments, New South Wales Premier Jack Lang was a divisive figure in politics for decades. The 1930s were perhaps the closest Australia ever came to a violent coup, such was the anger at the Lang government. Joining me to discuss this radical Labor Premier Jack Lang is Dr. David Clune, author of a new Australian Biographical Monograph on Lang. Welcome to Afternoon Light, David.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you on Afternoon Light, David. And you were, of course, the New South Wales Parliament's historian for a period. So I understand you've not just written on Lang, but also on William McKell and Neville Wran.
Yes, I also co-wrote the history of the New South Wales Parliament from 1856 to 2003.
Oh, well, that would have been a remarkable set of stories, and I'm sure one that was very, very enjoyable to write. But Jack Lang, he is a sort of a hero and a villain in Australian history. And I think for people outside of New South Wales, perhaps not so familiar, but in New South Wales, his legend and infamy live on, don't they?
Yes, I think he still has a sort of mythological heroic status to some people who just think he was the man who stood up against the bankers for the workers and was stabbed in the back by the King's representative. That sort of still resonates, I find, with all sorts of people, but the truth was much less flattering and much more devastating.
Yes, indeed. It's interesting reading the Australian Dictionary of Biographies entry on him. I think, was it Beadnan, the biographer there? He said he was a politician who achieved very little, which I thought was rather a sad, epitaph of his career. But tell me, David, how did Jack Lang start off his life in Sydney?
Well, it was a classic upbringing of working class deprivation and poverty. His father suffered from ill health. He had 10 children. He couldn't support them all. They lived in poverty in the inner city. At one stage, as was not uncommon, and Jack was sent to stay with relatives in Bairnsdale and spent some of his formative years there. So while some others like Bill McKell, who had a pretty challenging, shall we say, upbringing, it made them positive and gave them a desire to try and change the system for the better. It brought out in Lang a bitter, destructive side, that he was determined to get square with life no matter what. And he was just embittered all his life.
And that get square comes up, doesn't it? I mean, that sort of sense I think you say he has a permanent sense of grievance throughout his life, that real chip on his shoulder.
I think that was one of his defining characteristics. Plus there were other not very pleasant traits, like he was a great hater. And in terms of his personality, I frankly think he was a borderline psychopath.
Wow.
He had very few friends. It was actually said he never had a friend in his life. He was an aggressive egotist, little empathy for others, and few principles or ethics, frankly.
Before he entered politics, and he was in politics for an extraordinary length of time, I mean, he was criticised for being really a opportunistic political careerist, despite the reputation he had as a real, working class warrior. But he was quite a successful businessman before entering politics, and even while in politics, wasn't he?
Yes, that's one of the really interesting things about the story, and that most people in his situation went into blue-collar occupations, and the more lucky of them went into a trade. For example, Bill McKell became a boilermaker, and he was able to get into that because it was a very dangerous sort of a trade. But Lang somehow decided to succeed in the white-collar world, and so he became a clerk and worked his way up to owning or co-owning the state agency in Auburn and Sydney's West. And through a lot of successful speculation, he became a very wealthy man. A grand house and dressed in the best quality suits. So it was a very atypical Labor background in that sense. He never had anything to do with unions either, which most Labor people in those times used the unions as a way to get on. Bill McKell, for example, became secretary of the Boilermakers Society, and that launched him. But Lang never had any empathy for the unions, though he realised that he could use them to his advantage.
And why was that? Was it just the nature of his life's journey through employment? He wasn't involved in occupations that engaged with the union movement? Because it's very unusual for someone who was such a figure of the Labor movement, of the Labor Party.
Look, honestly, I don't know why. It is very unusual. It was almost a badge of honour to have had a union background, which he didn't. But he had an aptitude for business, and he was an auctioneer and a real estate agent. I mean, I suppose those persuasive sort of gifts that he later used to get 200,000 people into the domain enabled him to sell a lot of houses, perhaps.
And tell me about Auburn in Sydney's west, which really became Lang territory, didn't it?
Well, Auburn was a sort of almost a semi-rural area in Lang's early days when he moved there, but it started to develop and become industrialised and a dormitory suburb for Sydney. It then, in the post-war era, became very much a working class area as people moved out and migrants moved in. So, yes, it was an area that just grew, and Lang grew with it.
And he enters politics in an interesting way. Can you describe that journey from Auburn real estate agent and auctioneer to becoming a state politician?
Well, Lang was a prominent figure in the community, and the estate agent was a prominent figure then, and a lot of people were beholden to them because a lot of them were actually renting as well as buying. So, in fact, Jack, the great man of the people, was exploiting a lot of renters in his day. But he would have come to prominence through his business in the local community. Mm. I think he was involved with local community organisations. There was, in fact, an allegation, which I have to stress is not proven, that he was involved with some financial irregularities, one might say, in a local organisation. But he became a prominent figure, and the next thing, prominent figure, I suppose, like that is if you want to go into politics is you go onto the local council, which is what Jack did. And then he progressed to getting the Labor nomination for his local seat and winning it, and was never out of Parliament in one way or another until 1950.
Yes, it's amazing. He was the member for Granville, wasn't he, from 1913 to 46. It's a long time. And then, as you say, in federal parliament from 1946 to 50. So, yes, a hugely long amount of time in politics.
After he lost his federal seat, he actually ran for the Senate too. But he was unsuccessful, and that was the end of his career.
So you describe him as an almost psychopath, that he had no friends. I mean, let's be honest, sounds like a completely unpleasant person. But despite having no friends, he was incredibly cunning, wasn't he? He had some element of charisma, and he looked impressive. He was quite an attractive, tall man, wasn't he? But in what way was he able to attract support and build a large following? I mean, he really was held up as a hero. He must have done that through some particular gifts through his personality, despite the obvious unfortunate sides of it.
Some people who on a personal level can be terrible, as communicators, but if you put them into a large-scale environment, they're great communicators. And Lang was like that. He had an almost mesmeric ability to captivate and influence people. Mm. And in public, he was a powerful demagogue who was almost hypnotic in his public appearances. So you had that duality. But one story that's always fascinated me was that Governor Game, who, of course, eventually dismissed Lang and had lots of run-ins with him. He actually said in a memoir that he found that when he was talking to Lang as Premier, that Lang was almost mesmerising the governor as well. His power as a person was so strong. And the governor said, what I used to do was, I think he had a red setter as a pet. So the governor said, I got my red setter to sit down at the desk next to me. And when I felt I was being too mesmerised by Lang, I'd start stroking his head and he'd bark, and that put me back on the track. It's the story that's always fascinated me, that even someone like Sir Philip Game could be almost hypnotised by Lang.
Yeah, it does sound like you're describing some sort of hypnotherapy session. It's quite disturbing, really. He was elected opposition leader after entering the parliament in 1913. He was elected opposition leader in 1923, quite easily actually, by 21 votes to 11. He then becomes Premier for the first time, and he's Premier on two occasions in 1925. What did he achieve in that first term as Premier? Because, I mean, it's interesting. He's such a hero, but he's only Premier on two occasions for 2 years at a time, or not even 2 years for the second time. So he doesn't have a huge longevity in office, despite the enormous reputation and, I guess, at least his sort of legacy of personality and idolatry that is left behind.
Well, I think you're quite right. I mean, neither of his premierships ran the full term, but the first government is the one that would be the case for the defence, because the Labor Party in New South Wales, while it did come to office quite early in 1910, had been pretty unspectacularly unsuccessful in office. And the first government self-destructed over conscription. The later government fell apart due to factional strife. So the Labor faithful were getting restless, and they were saying, look, we've put all these politicians in, we've done all this hard work, and every time we get a government, they betray us. And Holman, of course, in the conscription split, left Labor and joined with the Conservatives. So, that was seen by many as the politicians selling out the party. So Lang played on that, and he basically said to workers, the Labor Party rank and file of the unions, I'm the person that's going to actually do something. We've had enough talk. I'm the man that's going to stand up and not sell you out and not betray you. And he did deliver in that first government, and the legislation was quite impressive. He legislated for quite progressive and beneficial legislation in fair rents, workers' compensation, working hours, industrial arbitration, and significantly he introduced widows' pensions, child endowment, now, which is a pretty formidable record when you consider that in Australia at the time there was basically no welfare system. Now, the downside of that was that Lang actually took the credit for what was done by a lot of his ministers. They were the ones that actually brought the legislation up, got it through, but Lang took credit for it and then portrayed himself to the Labor rank and file as the hero who'd done all these wonderful things for him. So they then became quite adulatory, saying, Lang's the man, and that's when the myth started to build. And in the second government, which didn't achieve very much at all, he was helped in a way by the Depression, because in that very, very dramatic and distressing time, it played into Lang's hands because he could sort of say, look, I'm the hero. I'm fighting for you. Bankers are trying to betray you. Everyone else has betrayed you. Trust me.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously had an amazing ability to bring the crowd with him, and in his public speaking was famous, so he used that to great effect. But in terms of the popularity of his welfare policy, and particularly, of course, in this first term as Premier from 1925 to 1927, I mean, he does lose the election in 1927. So despite the fact that he's considered one of the pioneers in Australia of welfare policy, he doesn't get electorally rewarded, does he?
Well, there was two sides to Lang. There was the progressive legislation in that first government, but the other side was Lang, being the complete autocrat that he was, would never put up with any dissent or competition, and he was ruthless in suppressing people. And he actually had no personal skills whatsoever. He was Pete Nairn described him as uncouth, brutal, rude. So he quickly alienated all his parliamentary colleagues. There were a number of attempts to depose him, which almost succeeded. So that divided the Labor Party, and these very public splits where the MPs were splitting from Lang and trying to bring him down, obviously that alienated the general voting public. So while you had these positive achievements, which particularly appealed to Labor people, the general population saw as well the division, the destruction, the infighting. So that's why he lost that election very convincingly. So
he really was the living example of disunity is death, I guess, in politics.
Absolutely, yes.
In that respect. Tell me about New South Wales in the 1920s? Because when you look at the history of New South Wales politically, I mean, it had a lot of Labor governments at the state level. And, I mean, of course, Bob Carr's more recent example, but McKell was a long-term premier, and you had Neville Wran, who, of course, you've written about, and Joseph Cahill. So there was a decent rump of people who were voting Labor in New South Wales. So when you say his policies attracted Labor-minded people, that was quite good electorally, presumably.
Yes, well, the New South Wales Labor Party, there's been a lot of mythologising about socialism and all this sort of thing, but I mean, the reality was that the New South Wales Labor Party, from its inception in the 1890s, was very much a moderate, middle-of-the-road party that was committed to parliamentary reform and to moderate reforms to help ordinary working-class people, middle-class people. And it attracted quite a bit of support from small farmers. The New South Wales Labor Party initially was much more of a rural party than an urban party. There were a lot of agricultural labourers and small farmers then who didn't see the Country Party as standing for anything other than the big graziers. So they tended to vote Labor. And you had sort of intellectuals, as you might say, too, school teachers and people like that who supported Labor. And in the city, a lot of small shopkeepers supported Labor too, because they saw that the main Conservative Party was dominated by the big retail firms, was not sympathetic to them, where Labor could say, we will bring in legislation to look after the small man. And so the Labor Party had a pretty broad base which you could draw on. And the story of the early Labor Party was very good at winning elections, but it could never stay in office because every time they got into office, they self-destructed. And then, as you said, in 1941, McKell came along and dramatically changed everything. I think I did write somewhere that he not only captured the middle ground, he colonised it. And they stayed in office until 1965, 41 to 65. And since then, Labor's been enormously successful. But that was the key to New South Wales Labor's success, that they realised that they had to stick together. What's the old saying? If we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. So that was the sort of ethos.
Yeah. Of course, in the late 20s, early 30s, the world experiences the Great Depression. And for a state like New South Wales that was reliant on export income, more so than, say, Victoria, it really bit into the New South Wales economy, and, of course, people's lifestyles and disposable income, and unemployment went up. The Premier at the time, and, of course, this was bad for the Conservative Premier in Tom Bavin, he had to try and work through the Great Depression in New South Wales. And unfortunately for him, he did have to fight an election against Jack Lang, once again approaching the premiership of New South Wales. Can you tell me about what was going on in policy terms for the Bavin government, and, of course, what Jack Lang brought to the table then?
Well, actually, Tom Bavin was a very decent person. He was a small L Liberal in the tradition of Carruthers and Alfred Deakin, and he actually had been friendly with Deakin. But Bavin had a few handicaps against Lang, where one was that he was basically an honest man. The other was that although he was a Liberal in terms of policy, he was also a Liberal in terms of classical economics, which meant that you had to balance the budget, you had to cut expenditure. The other problem that poor old Tom had was that he was dying of cancer while he was fighting that election campaign. And Lang, of course, being completely unencumbered with any sense of honesty, basically just ran a totally false campaign. I mean, there is an ad that I still remember. It has a picture of a gloomy man and a happy man, and the caption is just gloom under Bavin, happiness under Lang. And it was just that simple.
Well, it worked, didn't it? I mean, Lang won a landslide at the October 1930 election, didn't he, with 55 seats to the coalition's 35. So unscrupulous or not, it worked for him.
It did. Ben Chifley, who was a bitter opponent of Lang, had a wonderful phrase where he said, Mr. Lang offered the people economic rainbows, and the people were so desperate that they grabbed them to their detriment in the longer term.
But Lang was, of course, offering, as you say, these economic rainbows, maintaining the standard of living, reducing working hours, increasing unemployment relief and social security payments, all while having absolutely no plan of how to afford these things, how he could achieve these things, which constantly became his undoing, didn't it?
Well, Lang approached the Depression as he did everything else. How could he use it to his advantage? And he did have a plan, but it was totally unworkable. It was partly repudiation of debt. And then he had this strange theory that we should shift to something called the goods standard to balance our currency. And it was just a total fantasy. He just promoted this plan as his battle standard, and people believed it. And the working class were writing Lang is right all over their walls in the inner city. But he just was a man. He was just a man of expediency, that he was just going from one battle to the other and winning one to keep himself in power, and then going on to the other and making it up as he went along.
Where did the expression Lang is right come from? Did he formulate that himself, or was that some sort of clever spin doctor or a journalist who came up with it?
I think he had a very efficient propaganda machine which put out things like that. He had a newspaper and at one stage a radio station, but it just resonated that all of these poor folks in the deprived inner city areas going around painting Lang is right on the walls.
It sort of reminds me of today's fake news, where if you say it often enough, it becomes true. Even if it's not true, it's believed. Other politicians might deploy that, David.
Well, I think that's a very good analogy.
In 1931, the Commonwealth and the state premiers, in light of the Great Depression, they got together to work out a coordinated plan, the Premier's Plan. And, this was around, as you can expect, cutting government expenditure, increasing taxation, trying to reduce interest rates. Unfortunately, though, of course, Premier Lang wasn't going to be part of that, was he? Can you tell me what he proposed to do instead?
Well, he initially signed up to the Premier's Plan because he needed money. New South Wales was going broke at a rapid rate. There was no revenue. Lang would cut expenditure. He couldn't raise any money on the loan market. So the Commonwealth offered to give him some funding if he agreed to the Premier's Plan, which in typical duplicitous style he did, while he had no intention of abiding by it. So as soon as he got back to Sydney, he started denouncing the Premier's Plan and promoting his Lang Plan. And there were enough of the faithful out there who believed him. I think we have to really readjust to the context of the time. It's L.F. Crisp, the great historian, said that after decades of prosperity and full employment, it's very hard to conceptualise what it was like in the Depression. But people were literally starving. They didn't have clothes. They didn't have food. There were no jobs. There was a very meagre, pitiful sort of dole, and there were relief works, but it was absolute survival sort of stuff. It wasn't just doing it tough. It was, you were really on the verge of extinction. So that's the climate that led to a lot of the extremism of the time. And the people were so desperate that when Lang came along and said, I can fix it all up for you, they believed him. Actually, I did write an article with a friend of mine, Brian Dale, comparing Lang to Donald Trump. And we found there are a lot of similarities in the two personalities and the way they operated.
Yes, I'll have to look that up, David. The more I think about it, the more I can see there are similarities. Tell me, he was a successful businessman and made a lot of money. He said he had a very nice house and successful real estate business, owned newspaper, had a radio station. Where did his economic ideas come from? Because a lot of them seem like they are, the trouble with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. Surely he realised that in business you do need to keep bringing in revenue in order to keep spending, because otherwise you just end up drowning in debt and unable to repay it, and that's it. You have to close down.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because added to that was that Lang's first ministerial position was as Treasurer. And as Treasurer, he was regarded as a great success by the business community and heavily criticised by the unions because his economics were so orthodox. Yet the key to Lang's personality is he would do anything to win and to succeed. So as the situation got more desperate, rationality and common sense went out the window. And he had a group of people around him. He had a sort of what they call the inner group, which was his sort of bunch of thuggish henchmen who controlled the Labor Party, but he had a couple of journalists who also were in his inner circle. There was Harold McCall, he was one of the famous ones. There was A.C. Patterson. And I think they were the people that dreamed up a lot of this stuff like the Lang Plan for him. And I don't think Jack actually understood it, let alone anyone else. And I read accounts of ministers, Lang's ministers, saying, of course I don't understand the plan, but Jack will explain it to me. So they came up with these sort of things that were superficially plausible and enough to sort of throw out into the public arena and gain some credibility.
So after agreeing to the Premier's plan in 1931 and then actually countering it with his own plan, which extraordinary. I mean, you've said he replaced the gold standard with something called a good standard based on the wealth of Australia, which wasn't sure how he was going to have calculated that, but I guess no one else did. So that wasn't the point, sure as you said. But he also wanted to suspend interest payments to British bondholders. So repudiate on the repayment of debts, which he indeed did in April 31 and in February 32. How did this go down, David?
Well, the background to that is that New South Wales and Australia had basically supported themselves before the Depression on borrowing huge amounts of money on the London market. So that was the way you got on. That was the way you funded your infrastructure, that you borrowed in London. And while Australian credit was good and New South Wales credit was good and primary products could pay the interest bills, everything worked just fine. But all of a sudden, that easy money wasn't there anymore. So Lang was in the situation where he couldn't borrow money. He had no revenue coming in. He had debts. He needed to do something desperately. Now, with loans in the 1920s, there was an agreement between the Commonwealth and the states which set up the Loan Council. And the Loan Council was the body that raised the money for the Australian states and the Commonwealth. But the thing about that was that the Commonwealth government then became the guarantor of the debt. So Lang thought, well, I'll default. The Commonwealth government will have to pay that money. I've saved this money, which might keep New South Wales afloat for a little bit longer. So that was his justification, if you would call it that, for repudiating the debt. But also it was an amazingly popular strategy because those bloody pommy bankers are screwing us and we'll get back at them, good old Jack Lang. There was also a sort of thing about Australia had borrowed quite a lot of money in the First World War, and it was, people called it the blood debt, that Australia had done so much for the war effort, and yet we were paying huge amounts of interest to the British from the war. Now, that was completely untrue, in fact, that most of that war debt had already been repaid. But that was another thing too, the phrase, the blood debt. So all of that added up to a pretty powerful political weapon and an economic disaster.
Yes, I guess if you think about the 60,000 Australians who died in the First World War overseas, I mean, they didn't die on Australian territory, they died in Europe. I mean, there wouldn't have been a single person in Australia who was untouched by First World War. Everyone would have lost someone or known someone who died. So that would have resonated, that sort of sense of, well, why should we repay the British bank, the British bondholders, when we gave them our sons, our fathers, our uncles, our brothers?
Excellently put. That's exactly the situation.
But this didn't obviously practically work. And of course, the federal government was pretty unhappy with it, wasn't it? With Lang's.
Well, they were the suckers who had to pay the bill.
Yeah.
While Jack just took the kudos.
So what's the reaction then across New South Wales? I mean, his supporters, of course, think it's a great idea and it's working in their interests and they're not having to pay these debts and the federal government can pick up the pieces and New South Wales continues on. But there are parts of the community in New South Wales who are deeply unhappy with what Lang's doing, aren't they?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, to those that were desperate and down and out, they liked it because it was just something to grasp at. To other people, and this is not just people who are rich or well off, I mean, they could see how absolutely disastrous this was to the economic position of New South Wales and to New South Wales's credit. And a lot of those people, just ordinary folks, really had investments, they had mortgages, they had shares. And they could see that this was financially disastrous. And I mean, if they needed any evidence, the fact that the state government savings bank of New South Wales failed in 1931 after a run on its funds, a lot of people lost their savings through that. There's a very graphic picture of the bank was in Martin Place in Sydney, and there's a picture of a queue of people all the way up to the entrance to the bank trying to get their money out before the doors closed, and a lot of them didn't succeed. And one of the things that also precipitated Lang's downfall was that he was so desperate for money that he proposed to bring in a tax on mortgages. And this was that if you had a mortgage, you had to pay the government 10% of the value of your mortgage as a tax. And if you didn't do that within 14 days, your mortgage was forfeit to the Crown. So you can imagine the effect that that would have had on not just big investors people, but lots of small investors.
And what was happening in large parts of rural New South Wales was even more extreme in terms of their reaction, wasn't it? They were thinking about trying to secede from Sydney so they wouldn't have to be part of the Lang government.
The most radical movement was in the Riverina. It was led by a fellow called Charles Hardy, who later became a senator. But they had plans well advanced to secede from New South Wales and set up their own government. It wasn't just talk. They were moving towards that.
There were these two groups, weren't there, who were manoeuvring against the Lang government, the old guard and the new guard. And the new guard was plotting to seize Parliament House, wasn't it, and actually forcibly overthrow the Lang government. I mean, this got pretty close, didn't it? I mean, this was, I think, the closest Australia's ever got to some sort of violent coup to overthrow a government.
I think there's no doubt about that. There is a very good historian called Andrew Moore who wrote a book some years back called The Secret Armies and the Premier, and he really did a lot of research and exposed what was happening in great detail. But the new guard was run by a guy called Eric Campbell, who was basically a fascist, and he was a fairly incompetent, unpleasant sort of individual. The new guard were sort of flashy larrikin types who like to run around with guns and drill and then go and beat up communists and things like that. But as an organisation, they were pretty ineffective, but they did have plans to storm Parliament House, and they were going to take Lang prisoner, and I think they even had plans to put him in Berrima jail or something like this. But they were up against the New South Wales police, and the police response, he wasn't the commissioner, but Big Bill McKell was the senior policeman at the time. He was a tough New South Wales copper, and he was Lang's man. So he had the police arming themselves with machine guns and artillery and drilling. And if Parliament House was stormed, the police would have had their machine guns out there defending it. But the old guard, which Andrew Moore, I think, was, as I said again, has really revealed it as much more important, was mainly based in the rural areas of New South Wales, and it was mainly ex-servicemen, and it was very, very well organised, and they had a total membership of something like 30,000. These were well-trained ex-servicemen who knew how to shoot and what to do. And they had the tacit support of the Commonwealth government, the Lyons government, which was determined to overthrow Lang. So the old guard was waiting. What they were going to do was there was legislation passed by Bruce so that people could be sworn in as Commonwealth peace officers, and they were going to swear in the old guard en masse as Commonwealth peace officers and tell them to take over New South Wales. And the federal government actually had a destroyer stationed off the Heads, ready to bombard Sydney if it came to a war with Lang. So that's how serious the situation was.
It's said that New South Wales got dangerously close to some sort of civil war. Do you think that's true? I mean, were we really contemplating bloodletting on the streets of Sydney over this?
I don't think there's any doubt. I don't think there's any doubt at all that things were very, very combustible, and it wouldn't have taken much to set it all off. And Barbara Tuchman in August 1914 argues that just a series of unfortunate coincidences caused the First World War. I think you could have had just an unfortunate train of events that would have caused bloodshed in the streets. There is one story that Andrew Moore tells where a unit of the old guard in the bush got the wrong instructions and thought that they were to proceed to Sydney because the revolution had broken out. So they all got on the train and with their guns. Thank God someone stopped them. But I mean, if they had have turned up in Sydney at Central Station, if the local workers had turned out and there'd been shooting, I mean, things could have accelerated very dangerously.
Why do you think, David, they didn't think to resort to legal processes? The Commonwealth Government challenged what Lang was doing in the courts, or the opposition challenged what Lang was doing in the courts, or even just wait for an election. I mean, why was it so urgent that people were considering resorting to violence?
Well, I think the Commonwealth Government did challenge Lang's measures and overrule them with Commonwealth legislation. And the Legislative Council in New South Wales rejected a lot of Lang's more extreme measures. So there was this pushback against what he was doing. But when you're in a desperate situation like that, you can't really just go down to Phillip Street and have a court case that meanders on forever, and something had to be done. And that's where Governor Game comes into the picture, because he'd been extremely tolerant to Lang. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation, but when the governor and his ADC went into the Union Club, no one would sit with them because the governor was supposed to be sympathetic to Lang. So he was snubbed by Sydney society, but he kept his nerve. But towards the end, Game could see that the situation was just about to explode and something had to be done. And Lang gave him the excuse because he'd put out these illegal orders to the public service. And Game basically said to Lang, I consider this is illegal. Unless you could convince me by the end of the day that this is legal, I'm going to be forced to dismiss you. And Lang never produced any counter evidence. He didn't produce anything from the Crown Solicitor saying this is legal. He just waited. And so Game was as good as his word and sacked him.
So this was the first sacking of a government leader, a premier in this case, and of course in the case of Gough Whitlam, a prime minister. This was the first time a governor dismissed a leader in Australian history, the second being in 75.
Yes, the crucial difference is that I'm one of those that believe that Sir John Kerr, I think, did act correctly in the sense that Whitlam couldn't govern. He didn't have the confidence of the House. He didn't have supply. So the Governor-General had to do something. I'm also strongly of the view that Sir John Kerr acted very improperly by ambushing Whitlam and not warning him. I mean, as I said, Game said to Lang, you're doing the wrong thing. Unless you convince me that you're going to do the right thing, I'm going to have to dismiss you. Kerr could have said to Whitlam, Mr. Prime Minister, we're going to run out of money on such and such a day. If you can't convince me that you're going to be able to obtain supply, I'm going to have to dismiss you. So that was the crucial difference, I think.
So Lang's dismissed by Governor Game, and he goes quite quietly, doesn't he? I mean, he really doesn't put up a fight. He accepts it, and the opposition leader, Bertie Stevens, is commissioned to form an interim government until the election can be held.
Well, it's interesting that John Manning Ward, who was a professor of history at Sydney University for a long time and a very distinguished historian, he wrote a very interesting piece saying that Lang actually wanted to be dismissed because he got himself into such a terrible mess he couldn't see any way out. So he thought, I'll provoke my dismissal and that'll make me an heroic figure and then I'll come back. That's contestable, but to me it's plausible.
Yeah, as you say, he wanted to be taken down rather than step down himself in order to create that impression that he was sort of martyred to the cause of the workers and standing up to those British bondholders and the Commonwealth government. What happens to Lang politically after his dismissal? Because he never, ever again leads the Labor Party, does he?
No. The 1932 election was an astounding repudiation of Lang. I think in rural New South Wales he didn't win one seat. In the sort of suburban belt around Sydney, he might have won 2 or 3. Well, he was reduced to the rump in the inner city, and basically it showed that he was a spent force. But the Labor Party had enough too. They started to rebel as well, and that's where the Labor Party split. And there was an anti-Lang party formed, which actually started to win seats in by-elections rather than Lang's Labor Party. So the Labor Party as a whole and the Labor voters as a whole realised that Lang was a spent force. But like a lot of dictators, he just had this iron inner group that controlled the machine, and he just kept this ruthless grip and purged anyone who opposed him. And it's a miracle there was anyone left in the end, because he purged so many of his opponents. But that's why he survived for so long, because he just kept his grip on the party. The machine, not the faithful.
Yes, indeed. And he was eventually kicked out of the Labor Party, wasn't he?
Well, again, it's a sort of interesting and complicated story that when it looked like McKell was going to win in 1941 very decisively, as he deserved to do, and there were negotiations between the McKell forces who called themselves the official Labor Party, which I thought was a brilliant bit of PR to distinguish themselves from Lang, but they negotiated an agreement with Lang that the Lang people would come back into the party, which they temporarily did, but Lang was never going to be one who'd sit there quietly while someone else was in charge, and he started a campaign of troublemaking. He had a newspaper called The Century, which was the most vicious, vitriolic sort of publication. So in the end, McKell and his allies sort of said, enough is enough, and they expelled him from the party. And there were anticipations that it might precipitate a major split, but it didn't, because the people that went with Lang were just really hardcore supporters. And I think that the Lang party never polled much more than 10 or 12%, because McKell had proved in office that the official Labor Party was the party that could deliver, and the voters rallied behind him.
Indeed. After McKell won the 41 election, Labor was in office for 24 years after that, which is incredible. Even longer than at the federal level, the Liberals being in power for 23 years. And Menzies, Holt, Gorton and McMahon. So McKell obviously found a way to make things work, but it needed to be without Lang in the party. But, of course, interesting end to this story is that in 1971, the New South Wales branch of the Labor Party brought Lang back in after a campaign by his protege, Paul Keating.
Yes, well, Keating was attracted to Lang, and he used to go and visit Lang in his old age, and he swallowed the Kool-Aid, as you might say, and became a great Lang supporter. And it was Keating that tried to get him readmitted to the party. There were those with long memories who had been disadvantaged by Lang and knew what he was really like, and they fought it. There was particularly a fellow called Bill Colborne, who'd been the secretary of the party, who'd suffered enormously thanks to Lang. And Bill Colborne stopped it the first time. Then he couldn't get the numbers the second time, but he imposed a condition on Lang's readmission to the party. Keating sort of wanted him gloriously readmitted by the conference. Maybe Lang was going to wander down the aisle to great applause and all that. But Bill Colborne got the motion changed that Lang could be readmitted to the party, but he'd have to rejoin his local branch in the ordinary way.
I see.
So there was a sting in the tail.
Right. So at the age of 94, Lang's readmitted, and I think he passes away at the age of 97. So he gets the last 3 years of his life, which I note that his son said he thought that justice had at last been won. He was too proud to ask to re-enter the ALP. He would have been remorseful if his life had finished and he was still outside the party. He always saw himself as a Labor man. So he got what he wanted at the end.
Well, there's an old saying, don't speak ill of the dead, I suppose. But, I wouldn't agree with any of that statement.
So Lang was often said to be greater than Lennon, which, I mean, I find that a bit of an uncomfortable expression given what Lennon did and what people have done in Lennon's name. But that certainly was something that attracted people to him, people who were of a socialist mindset, and still attracts them to this day in terms of his positioning as a great advocate for the working class, a real hero.
Well, that particular phrase was uttered by a fellow called Jock Garden. Jock Garden was an extraordinary character and not a very reputable one. I think he'd originally been a clergyman and then he became a communist. He was expelled from the ALP because he was a member of the Communist Party. He was an enemy of Lang. Then when Lang became successful, Jock Garden decided that he better get on the winning side. So he turned right round and befriended Lang and became his greatest apologist. So Lang was basically a conservative, but in his desire for power, he would go anywhere. So he realised that he could cultivate the left by whipping things up by his anti-capitalist rhetoric. So the left kept him in power for a long time. But It's worth noting that when he left the Labor Party in the end, he formed what was called the Australian Labor Party Anti-Communist. And that was the label that he had for the last years of his political life.
So he really had a sort of similar approach then in some ways to the Victorian B.A. Santa Maria in terms of his anti-communist point of view, but within the context of Labor politics.
He became very much an extreme anti-communist in his final years, but as I said, when it suited him, he was very happy to have the support of the Communist Party and ex-communists like Jock Garden.
He was opportunistic to the end, I guess.
Absolutely.
David, thank you so much for illuminating us, listeners on Afternoon Light, about the political radical Jack Lang. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I thoroughly encourage people to dip into your biographical monograph on Lang to discover more.
Thank you, Georgina. It's been a great pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook.